all this creation as well, which we learn in the 9th chapter, verse number 4. So this extraordinary personality, who's beyond all of those things, he's coming and talking to us today. Do you know? It's phenomenal. You know, you can talk to the Supreme. You can appear in the deity form. And these are all incredible spiritually scientific processes that we can put into practice, and we can actually experience, you know, spiritual life. We can experience spiritual relationship. You know, we were talking a little bit at the start there about, you know, when God comes, he actually speaks to us. So we can, you know, he's considered to be. He says himself, he's our greatest friend. You know, we all have friends, which is very important, and so on. But God is our greatest friend, and he's our, you know, he's, yeah, both from the you know, he's the source of everything, and he's the person that we can, he's the source of us. We have life. If you can just kind of blank for a minute and say, okay, there's nothing there. Oh, what's happened? Where am I? But no, I'm here. We're here. So we're here because God is here, because he's given us this. He's given us the power to see, to hear. You know, we didn't do any of this. We're not getting our heart to beat now, you know, but yet it's beating. How's that happening? We're not doing anything like that. This is all given to us by Krishna. So we get the vision to see Krishna everywhere. And the spiritual master gives us that vision, because he's seen the truth. I remember I was just talking earlier, when I came to hear it originally, I came to a class in Trinity, was talking about the truth. How to just trying to find the truth. And the truth, and we all know this phrase, the truth will set you free. Because it does. But what the truth is confusing in the material world. Because, you know, the famous phrase, what's your truth? You know, ever heard that one? As if there was all different versions of it. But actually the Supreme, this is why it's a science. It's a science of understanding the soul's relationship with the Supreme, which in other words, our relationship with God, and how we can learn to love God, and how God loves us more than we can ever imagine. So that's what this science is doing. Is there any questions so far? Any comments? Any basics so far? I kind of stopped in the middle there. Just because we're coming to this part. When one's heart is thus cleared of material, one can understand the science of Krishna. Simply to understand that a living entity is not material is not sufficient. That may be the beginning of spiritual realization, but one should recognize the difference between, listen, activities of the body and the spiritual activities of one who understands he is not the body. We'll come back on that later. In the 7th chapter, we've already discussed the opulent potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his different energies, the inferior and superior natures, and all this material manifestation. Now, in chapter 9, the glories of the Lord will be delineated. The Sanskrit word, anasuyave, in this verse, is also very significant. Generally, the commentators, even if they are highly scholarly, are all envious of Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Even the most erudite scholars write on Bhagavad Gita very inaccurately, because they are envious of Krishna. Their commentaries are useless. The commentaries given by the devotees of the Lord are bona fide. No one can explain Bhagavad Gita or give perfect knowledge of Krishna if he is envious. One who criticizes the character of Krishna without knowing him is a fool. So such commentaries should be very carefully avoided. For one who understands Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the pure and transcendental personality. These chapters will be very beneficial. So I just stopped there at that point. It's just that it's at the top of this page here. It's the third paragraph up towards the end. Simply to understand that a living entity is not material is not sufficient. Why is it not sufficient? Can anybody answer? Why is it not sufficient? I mean, most people don't even know that. Why is it not sufficient just to know that the living entity is not material? Is the living entity material? No. Okay. We'll accept that. The living entity is not material. Look, everything else here is material, this body is material. But the living entity is not. It's beyond all of this.
Is it because it's just a theory, but you don't know what it means in practice?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because this is where the science comes in. You have to practically practice it, to actually check it out. Is it real? Yeah. So, it's very nice the way Prabhupada puts it, actually. He says, one should recognize the difference between activities of the body and the spiritual activities of one who understands that he is not the body. So, if one understands that he's not the body, and his activities, and what are those activities? What type of activities are they?
Hearing, chanting.
Yes, very good, very good. They're devotional service. They're activities to please Krishna. Because the other activities are generally to please ourselves. We've got some motivation. And what type of devotional service is this chapter speaking about? Pure devotional service. Unmotivated, pure devotional service. And so Prabhupada did. I just want to get back on that purport because we understand what Prabhupada said about this. Well, maybe not everybody has studied the second and third chapter Bhagavad Gita, but it said there in one of the chapters or one of the paragraphs that the second, the very beginning of Bhagavad Gita, the first chapter is more or less an introduction to the rest of the book, and the second and third chapters, the spiritual knowledge described is called confidential. So basically, in the second chapters and third chapters, it is just the information. You're not this body, you're your soul. It's explaining the difference between the soul and the body. There's a lot of amazing verses there in the second chapter that describes that. So if you want it, you have it. If you've done it before, great. It's still good to do it, even if you have done it before. But keep going back on that because it helps. The repetition is very important, because it's the mind from minute to minute. Because the mind is like that; it kind of drifts off into material things. So when you spend the time with the philosophy, then you'll start to feel it more. You'll start to be in that mood, in that zone, as they say. And then the 7th and 8th chapter are specifically related to devotional service because they bring enlightenment in Krishna consciousness. They're called more confidential. Yeah, 7 and 8 was really good. It talks, and Prabhupada goes on and says what it was about. Because they bring enlightenment in Krishna consciousness. Anyway, basically the 6th, 7th, and 8th chapters, 7 and 8 chapters, they talk about the prakriti, the different elements, and they talk about the soul, which is beyond these elements. They give you a much better understanding of earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. These are the coverings of the soul. And the mind, because, if someone says, you're not the soul, but who are you then? Are you the mind? No, we're not the mind. Because the mind is actually material. That's quite extraordinary, isn't it? The mind is just, it's like one of these other parts. It's more subtle. And then there's the intelligence. And then there's the false ego. So they all together, those things make up the gross material elements. But then it says in 7.5, Krishna then explains that But beyond all of this is the spiritual energy, you know, that is the soul, you know, and the soul is part of God. So this soul is here in among all of us. We all are the soul. But we got these bodies though, we're covered in the bodies. In that sense. So that's why the association of devotees is so important, and that's why hearing from devotees is so important, because they understand that. Whereas people generally don't understand that, they will be seeing it Bhagavad Gita for a different reason. That's what Prabhupada is also saying. And discussion is very important because it brings out that whole aspect of us being the soul. Because you know most people don't even know there's a soul. The best they think it's the mind, and then they have psychology and you know how to cure the diseases of the mind basically. But they don't go beyond that, like even the intelligence and then the false ego. So these are important parts and coverings as well, which is the false ego, because we have to understand how we're entangled here. You know, we have to understand what's entangling us here, because if you don't know what that is, then you will not be able to untangle yourself. And the idea is that we need someone else to help in that, and generally that is someone who knows that they're the soul, and someone who knows that they're the soul, they can remove or you know bring us outside that dimension and that realm, you know, and they can talk about the spiritual realm. So is there any questions so far? Any comments? Anything like to go on? Because I'm going to turn into the next verse, which is one of the most powerful verses, and they're all powerful verses in Bhagavad Gita. I keep on saying this is the most, but this is the most confidential knowledge, and Prabhupada goes on to explain this verse. I remember myself and my devotee friend Pragosh Prabhu, we learned this over 40 years in a van in West distributing books about Bhagavad Gita and stuff. Driving along, and we stopped at a place. It was three of us were traveling, staying in the van, and during the summer, sometimes during the winter as well, so much eating, but it was pretty powerful, very, very powerful energy. You'd be so focused. All day you'd be talking about Krishna on the street, giving people books, you know, telling people why they should take this book and so on. And then the evening time, the morning time you'd have a class, and then you would chant 16 rounds of japa, 2 hours. And then all day you'd be giving out books. Then the evening time you come back, you'd have some food, and you would discuss the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita. You know, that's a really turned on program. If you ever get a chance to do that, do it. You know, and we do it a little bit. Like tomorrow, between 12 and 3, we're going to be between 12 and 3, and this gentleman here has joined us on many occasions. We're going to be out there in front of, on the corner basically, and we're going to be distributing some books. So if anybody wants to have the pleasure of trying that and trying to talk to people about books, give it a go. But it's called high sadhana. It's one of the most powerful types of sadhana you can do. Why? Because you're right up against it. People start to tell you all these types of things. You know, they tell you there's no such thing as God. I don't believe in God. I don't. Then you have to really dig deep. You know, you have to dig deep you have to pray to God as well, and you'll be amazed at what you say, you know, what you come up with, because Krishna or God is working through you. So this is the power of God, and this is what we're meant to. And Prabhupada's going to speak in this next verse. But okay, I'm going to read the next verse, and then I'm going to ask other people to read different paragraphs. Raja Vijay Rajaguyam Pavitram Idam Jaksavagamam Dharmyam Shushakam Kartamaviyam. This knowledge is the king of education, the most secret of all secrets. It is the purest knowledge, and because it gives direct perception of the self by realization, it is the perfection of religion. It is everlasting, and it is joyfully performed. Which of those descriptions did you prefer the most? Anybody? Which one did anyone really resonate?
It is joyfully performed.
It's joyfully performed, yeah. That's a pretty good one. If you see someone who says they're doing devotional service and they're like this, oh, I have to do this devotional service. They're not doing devotional service. Or it's maybe in the mode of ignorance or something. But it's joyfully performed, definitely. Any ideas? Why is it joyfully performed? Why are you joyfully performing?
Because it's the natural state of a
Yes.
spirit to serve Krishna.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And that's what this is going to be about. This is what this verse is about. It's going to teach about how to be in that state, you know, to get into that natural state. That's the whole purpose of this verse, actually, is to get into that state where and to learn about it. Why? Because we need to be in. Anybody answer that? Why by that state? But the answer, I shouldn't have said the answer, but I'm just following what Prabhupada said. The answer is that because that's the state we'll be in the spiritual world, and we'll not be here anymore. We won't be birth and death and birth and death and birth and death. Even if you're a big high demigod or something like that, it's no use. It's useless. But beyond birth and death, that's what we want to get. So that's why we're teaching this, or why Prabhupada's teaching this. So we'll know what that state is when we're in the spiritual world, and we'll know how to get there. We'll be practicing it here, and then Krishna will give us the energy how to get into that state. Because we don't know, we don't really know. You know, we've been just here for so long, and many lifetimes, and we just go about our business, become this, that, the other, live for 70 years, then die, and then come back again as something else. You know, that's what we're programmed to do, and that's what this program in the world is like. You know, it's all set people up to go into this whole situation and just to come back again. It's completely mindless. You know, it's completely mindless. It doesn't have any purpose. You know, but this is teaching that's why this is one of the things that's explained here about education. What did it say? This is the
secret of secrets.
Yes, the secret of secrets, but it is the king of education. You know, because I know a lot of people. Yeah.
What happens when the cycle ends?
Well, you know, that's what we're going to learn. You know, we're going to learn what it's like when the cycle ends, because in the previous text it said that you can do this even if you're in this world. You can be in that consciousness, even in the material body, which is fading and stopping, is going to stop at some point. But if you're in that consciousness, you'll not come back. So we're training even now. It's called Jivan Mukta Saruchite, liberated even while in the body, because the body is just kind of fading away. You know, birth, death, disease, old age. You know. So it's
Actually meant like the birth and death cycle.
Yes.
What happens when that ends? Like
you're in the spiritual world. You're in the spiritual world. Because it's an unnatural state. The whole birth and death state is unnatural. It's illusory. It's real enough because we all feel the reality in a sense. You know, we can, if I do this, you know, we can feel the reality to a certain degree. You know, but it is temporary. You know, in 100 years' time, me doing that, or even getting my finger chopped off, you know, whatever. It's not going to be real in 100 years' time. You know. Hopefully, it'll never be real again. We'll see. But you know, that's just finished. It's is that what you mean by that? You know? Yeah. It's just it's finished. You're in your real situation. This is the illusory situation here. You know, it's a temporary situation, and it's not us. Do you ever see that ad in the bus about an Irish person? You know, it's like somebody with a pipe and he's going like this, and it says, "This is not us." You get that one? Yeah. You know, it's like a typical Irish person, and he says, "This is not us." Well, it isn't. It's a very philosophical point on the bus. I don't know if they really meant it that way, but you know, I'm in an Irish body now. What was us? Hopefully, I won't be in another. But I've obviously been in other bodies before this one, so that's the nature. So that was two. We got you got the secret of all secrets, yeah, and we got the king of education, and the first one we got it is joyfully performed. So it is the purest knowledge. Why is it the perfection of religion? Why is this the perfection of religion?
Because it's the conclusion of all religious scriptures.
It is, but it gives it even more clearly what that means here. You can read it, it's there. It gives direct perception of the self by realization. We actually can see who we are. That's what it means. So that's the perfection of religion. Any type of religion. And that's why Bhagavatam is so you'll find the Vedic scriptures are very, they're not sectarian. They're very, very broad. You notice that the Vedics, they never went to try to conquer other religions and supplant it with their own religion. That never happened. Why? Because they're very broad. They can see the religion in other spiritual systems, in other places. They appreciate actual religion because it's bhakti, it's devotional service. So it's found in all different religious systems. So therefore you'll find, and this is a huge gift that the Vedic scriptures can give to the world. This non-sectarian, because you see so much sectarian religion. If you're not my religion, then you're finished. You're going to go to hell, And people are going around and thumping people over the head with that, And they're going to go to hell if they keep doing that, because it's a completely neophyte view on religion. There is verses that Prabhupada used to quote, Savais, Pungsam Harodamo, Yato Bhaktir at Hochiti, Ahaitiki Apatiyata, Yayatna Sudosiditi. Is that religion which is gives direct service to the Supreme. That is the highest religion. And it doesn't matter where it's found, which religious system. If somebody is serving God, that is the highest system. So it's not sectarian religion, it is science. Do you get it? This whole thing is science, it's the Vedic science. So that's why it's so powerful. It's 5 to 7 and we're just coming to probably one of the longest verses and purports. And Shama's going to give the talk next week, and she's very lucky to be able to talk on this because it is such a power-packed verse. I just want to read if somebody could read the first paragraph. Any volunteers? Read the first paragraph.
Yeah.
This chapter of Bhagavad Gita is called the King of Education because it is the essence of all doctrines and philosophies explained before. Among the principal philosophers in India are Gautama, Kannada, Kapila, Yajnavalkya, Shandilya and Vaishvanara. And finally there is Vyasadeva, the author of Vedanta Sutra. So there is no dearth of knowledge in the field of philosophy and transcendental knowledge. Now the Lord says that this 9th chapter is the king of all such knowledge, the essence of all knowledge that can be derived from the study of Vedas and different kinds of philosophy. It is the most confidential because confidential or transcendental knowledge involves understanding the difference between the soul and the body, and the king of all confidential knowledge culminates in devotional service.
So you see that same point be made again. To know the difference between the body and the soul, but that's not enough. You have to perform devotional service. Then you actually get real realization, real knowledge. So that point has been made over and over. So this is why this whole is training us how to perform devotional service, because that's what we'll be doing in the spiritual world. So we get the knowledge of what we need to do to be there. Okay, anyone like to read the next chapter, the next paragraph? Any- anyone read this?
Generally, people are not educated in this confidential knowledge. They are educated in external knowledge. As far as ordinary education is concerned, people are involved with so many departments: politics, sociology, physics, chemistry, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, etc. There are so many departments of knowledge all over the world and many huge universities, but there is, unfortunately, no university or educational institution where the science of the spirit soul is instructed. Yet, the soul is the most important part of this body. Without the presence of the soul, the body has no value. Still, people are placing great stress on the bodily necessities of life, not caring for the vital soul.
Okay, so this information continues. Thank you, that's really nice. The next, anyone like to read the next paragraph?
The Bhagavad Gita, especially from second chapter on, stresses the importance of soul. In the very beginning, the Lord says that this body is perishable and that the soul is not perishable. Antavanta ime deha nitya shoktaha sharira niha. This is a confidential part of knowledge, simply knowing that the spirit soul is different from this body and that its nature is immutable, indestructible and eternal. But that gives no positive information about the soul. Sometimes people are under the impression that soul is different from the body and that when body is finished or one is liberated from the body, soul remains in the void and becomes impersonal. But actually, that is not the fact. How can the soul, which is so active within this body, be inactive after being liberated from the body? It is always active. If it is eternal, then it is eternally active, and its activity in the spiritual kingdom are the most confidential part of spiritual knowledge. These activities of the spirit soul are therefore indicated here as constituting the king of knowledge, the most confidential part of all knowledge.
So what's the point that's being made there about, sorry, I don't want to put everybody off, but what is the point that's being made there about the soul and it being active? Anyone like to take that up? The soul is active, right? What is the point that Brahma is making in that purport? Anyone like to take a guess?
I think he's trying to explain, if I understood it, that there are various theories about the body and the soul and what happens after the soul leaves the body, but nobody has been able to understand what actually happens to it or whether it is active, inactive. There are misconceptions about it being inactive in some understandings, and even though people do know it is active, but like they don't exactly know what happens after the soul leaves the body. So he's trying to hint at what's gonna come next, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the fact is that now you see, even in the body here now, we're all very active. Like, we all came here, we went on the bus, we got the train or whatever. You know, we're always active, you know. And then somehow to say that at the end, when the body stops, that the soul is inactive, it doesn't make any sense. It's completely, totally illogical. And what you're saying here is, no, the soul is active, is very active. And so we're learning about what the soul is like, here, how the soul is active, but it's also training us for what the soul will do in the spiritual world. You know, it's training us on what we are and what we will do, and that's why it's called the most confidential part of knowledge, because it's not being taught anywhere. You know, it's just not being taught anywhere what the soul does in the spiritual world. And promise, this is the most important part. So, the other important part there as well is that, you know, just because you might be clever in this world, or you might be intelligent, or you might be, you know, materially successful in this world, that type of intelligence is not the important when it comes to this spiritual intelligence. You know, in fact, it can be a hindrance, because you think you know what's what. But I've explained many occasions that, you know, we can't even, you know, dictate what our heart is doing from one minute to the next, what our digestion is doing, that our breathing is going on. You know, this is all happening. We're not in control of any of this. So what makes us think we know anything? You know, what makes us really think that we have an understanding of things? You know, we've done nothing for it to allow us to exist the way it is. We haven't done anything to allow us, you know, for us to be. We're only here, and we're only being because we've been given this. We've been given this ability to be conscious of what's happening. Otherwise, we're just like that, like matter. So we've got this ability, and then we're trained in this consciousness to understand things. So what I'm saying is that the knowledge is coming from a higher dimension. It's not coming from maths books, physics books, this book, that which is information from the material world, which is, we seem to try to get a handle on it. We could try to use it manipulate it for different reasons, you know. That type of knowledge, and then you know what happens? We think we're God. You know, just because we can manipulate the energy like that, we actually think we're God. And that's why, at the very start of this verse, it said that we can only understand this knowledge if we're not envious. What that really means is that we don't think that we're in control or we can do things, because that's God's position. It's not our position. But we somehow or other try to manipulate that. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Everybody's doing it. You know what I mean? Everybody in the material, and then so you might have some conflict there, isn't it? But this is because everyone thinks that what they're doing is the right thing. You know, it starts with individuals, then it comes to, you know, countries and whatever. And then you have so much conflict. But that knowledge is just the knowledge of matter. We need this information to come from a higher source. And that's why Prabhupada calls this the king of education. You know, this is the real education. And he came when he was 7 years old with no money from India to America, on 2 heart attacks on the way over, and a boat, you know. Why? Because he wanted to tell everybody this. That's the only reason he came. He wanted to come to America, the worst part of the material world in the sense for materialism, you know, for completely the opposite. And he underwent so many austerity. He never had anything in his life. He never owned anything. Yet, you know, he could still stay, you know, he had so many temples everywhere. But that's the nature of a pure devotee, and that's the nature of God's mercy. Because God, he appears okay, he's in our heart, but God doesn't know what we experience as such. Because we can experience, because we're not God, but we can experience as the individual. So what does God do? He empowers the individual, the spiritual God, because he's able to relate to us better. And so Prabhupada, friends, he came across in that huge journey, and he set up in New York City, and he lived in one of the worst areas of New York City. But it didn't bother him, because he was completely fixed on this message that he got from his spiritual master, and he was inspired by God to do it. So that's the type of knowledge that we're getting here, you know. And this problem, he would go around, he went to multi-universities, so many different speaking engagements, so many politicians, all very important people, but he never changed 1 inch the message. You know, he never compromised, because he said, no, this is the understanding. So we have a fantastic gift in this Bhagavad Gita, and next week Shama will be here, and she will be taking on the mantle, and we'll be discussing these incredible verses, and purpose by Srila Prabhupada, because that's what we're discussing. Unfortunately, I can't take any comments or questions because we're gone beyond the time. But, thank you very much for attentively hearing, and please read this text at home, and get absorbed in it, especially in the morning time early if you can. Srimad Bhagavad Gita ki jai. Srimad Bhagavad Gita ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So next part we're going to do some kirtan, and I think I'll set up a time. No. Okay. Please. Lord Chaitanya, as we see here, he made the process even more simple. And that is that just by chanting alone, we can actually go back to the spiritual world. And so the whole idea is that just kind of go deep into the chanting and meditating, and respond, because we start off with the singing, and then you respond with the Maha Mantra, as we have up here, the Hare Krishna mantra. And you'll find that by entering into that mood of the Hare Krishna mantra, the Krishna has agreed to appear in the mantra, and you can communicate with Krishna. And it especially happens when we all chant together. There's a special power in that. It's called the congregation or Sankirtan, chanting together. And that will help our spiritual life, knowing a lot. Hare Krishna. Playing and Kirtan playing in the near future.
In the near future, yes.
So if anyone wants to come, he's been playing it since he was 2. Don't embarrass him. Hare
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 You like to sing? Huh? Very good. Very good.
Hare
किसी भगवान की समझ भक्त मुझे Hare Krishna.